After my father passed away, my stepmother told me, "You have 24 hours to leave this house, it's mine now." I thought she was bluffing until she threw my bags onto the lawn. The next morning the lawyer handed me a letter that made her scream in rage. I stood there, staring at my suitcase lying in the dirt, my hands shaking with anger. The front door slammed in my face. My stepmother's words echoed in my head like a bad dream. "You have 24 hours to leave this house, it's mine now." I thought she was just being dramatic, caught up in her usual self-importance. But she wasn't bluffing. She meant it. And now, here I was, kicked out of the only home I'd ever known, my father barely cold in his grave. Let me back up a little. My name's Daniel, and I was raised by my dad after my mom died when I was 6. It was always just the two of us and we got by. He wasn't a rich man, but he worked hard, saved wisely, and made sure I had everything I needed. He met Patricia, my stepmother, when I was in high school. She was charming at first, the type of woman who could make strangers adore her within minutes. But once the wedding was over, that mask slipped. She made it clear that I was nothing more than an inconvenience to her. Still, my dad was happy, and I wasn't about to ruin that. Fast forward a few years, and my dad got sick. Cancer. The kind that moves fast and doesn't give you time to prepare. I dropped everything to be with him. Patricia, on the other hand, barely lifted a finger. She acted like playing the role of the grieving wife was more exhausting than actually taking care of him. I was the one who took him to appointments, who sat with him through chemo, who held his hand when he was too weak to speak. Patricia made excuses. She had errands to run, appointments to keep. In reality, she was off spending his money, living her life like nothing had changed. Then, just like that, he was gone. And not even 24 hours after we buried him, she turned to me in the living room and said, "You need to pack your things and get out." I laughed. I actually laughed, thinking she was just being cruel for the sake of it. "You're kidding," I said. Her face was stone cold. "This house is mine now. You're an adult, figure it out." I still didn't believe she was serious until she stormed off, came back with a trash bag and started throwing my clothes into it. "You can't do this," I said, grabbing my stuff from her hands. "Oh, but I can," she sneered. "Your father left everything to me. The house, the accounts, everything. There's nothing here for you." I tried to argue, but she just smiled like she'd been waiting for this moment. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the porch with the few belongings I had managed to grab, running through every conversation my dad and I had ever had about the house, about his will. I had no money, nowhere to go. My dad had always been responsible, but he hadn't been thinking clearly toward the end. Had he really left me with nothing? The next morning, I went to my father's lawyer, a man named Mr. Reynolds who had handled all of his affairs for years. When I walked into his office, he sighed, like he already knew why I was there. "I was expecting you," he said, sliding a thick envelope across the desk. I opened it, my hands shaking. Inside was a letter from my father, written months before he passed. "Daniel, if you're reading this, then Patricia has shown her true colors sooner than I expected. I know she will try to take everything from you. That's why I made sure she can't. The house is not hers, the accounts are not hers, and she will soon find out that everything she thought she inherited is, in fact, yours." Reynolds will explain the details. "Stand tall, son. Don't let her push you out of what is rightfully yours." I blinked at the words, my heart pounding. "She lied," I said under my breath. "She did," Reynolds confirmed. "Your father saw this coming and took precautions. Patricia gets nothing." I stared at him. "She told me she inherited everything." "She certainly thinks she did. But your father transferred the house and all assets into a trust under your name before he passed. He left her with an allowance, but that's already been revoked due to her actions." I sat there stunned. "She's going to lose it," Reynolds smiled faintly. "She already has." I left his office and drove straight back to the house. I wasn't nervous anymore. I wasn't scared. I was angry. When I pulled into the driveway, Patricia was standing on the porch, sipping her overpriced coffee like she hadn't just thrown her late husband's son onto the street. She looked surprised to see me. "I thought I made myself clear," she said, crossing her arms. I stepped onto the porch, towering over her. I pulled the letter from my pocket and handed it to her. "This is from my father. You might want to read it." She snatched it from me, her eyes skimming over the words. Her smug expression faded, replaced with something ugly. She read it again, her hand starting to shake. Then she screamed, a raw, furious sound that made the neighbors peek through their windows. She crumpled the letter in her fist, her face red with rage. "You're lying," she shrieked. "This isn't real. He wouldn't do this to me." I pulled out a second envelope, the official paperwork from Reynolds. "It's all here. The house, the bank accounts, everything. You own nothing, Patricia. In fact, you're trespassing on my property." She went completely still. Then her face twisted in fury and she lunged at me. Her perfectly manicured nails aiming straight from my face. I barely had time to react before she shoved me backward, screaming like a wild animal. This is my house. I was his wife. You are nothing. I grabbed her wrist before she could claw at me, forcing her back a step. You need to leave, Patricia, I said, my voice calm but firm. Right now. Her eyes were wild, darting around like she was searching for a way out of this nightmare. But it wasn't a nightmare, it was reality, a reality she had brought on herself. Then her expression changed. The rage melted into something else, something dangerous. A slow smile curled on her lips. You think you've won? She said, smoothing her dress like she hadn't just tried to scratch my face off. You really think this is over? I knew that look. It was the same one she had whenever she was about to do something manipulative, something cruel. I didn't respond. I just stepped aside and pointed toward the driveway. Get out. She didn't move. You can't just throw me out like a stray dog. I have nowhere to go. I let out a sharp laugh. You threw me out less than 24 hours after my father died. Don't expect me to feel sorry for you. Her eyes narrowed. Then without another word she turned and stormed inside. I followed, keeping a few steps behind her. She went straight to the bedroom she had shared with my father, yanking open drawers, grabbing clothes, stuffing them into a suitcase. But she wasn't packing up to leave. No, she was too calm for that. Then it hit me. She was taking things. My father's things. I strode forward, yanking the suitcase out of her hands. No, I said firmly. You don't get to take anything. She let out a bitter laugh. You think you can stop me? I know I can. She glared at me for a long moment. Then, with deliberate slowness, she reached for my father's watch on the nightstand, the one he never took off until the day he got too weak to wear it. That belongs to me, she said, her voice dripping with venom. I stepped forward, towering over her. That was my father's, I said. You don't get to keep pieces of him when you treated him like he was nothing. She clenched her jaw, but I saw something flicker in her eyes, something desperate. You think I didn't love him? She spat. You think I don't deserve something after wasting years of my life with him? My hands curled into fists. Get out. She snatched up the watch, shoving it into her pocket. You'll regret this, she hissed before shoving past me. I followed her down the hallway, making sure she didn't try to take anything else. She made a show of grabbing her designer handbag, lifting her chin like she wasn't about to be kicked out with nothing. But then, right as she reached the front door, she paused. Slowly she turned back to me, her lips curling into a smirk. You really should have been nicer to me, she said. Then she walked out, slamming the door behind her. And that's when everything went to hell. The nightmare begins. I should have known she wouldn't go down without a fight. Patricia was a snake, and snakes don't just slither away, they strike when you least expect it. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating non-stop. I groggily reached for it and saw a flood of missed calls and messages from unknown numbers, from family members I hadn't spoken to in years, from reporters. I frowned and opened the first message. You should be ashamed of yourself, throwing your grieving stepmother onto the street. Your father would be disgusted. My stomach dropped. I clicked on a link someone had sent me and my blood ran cold. It was an article. A sensationalized one. Millionaire's greedy son evicts heartbroken widow days after husband's death. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the garbage they had written. The article painted Patricia as a devoted wife, a loving woman who had stood by my father's side through his illness, only to be cruelly kicked out by his selfish, ungrateful son. The worst part? They had a picture of me, one from the funeral looking cold and distant, and next to it a staged photo of Patricia sitting on a suitcase wiping away fake tears. This lying, I cut myself off, gripping my phone so hard my knuckles turned white. She was good. She had run straight to the media, spinning a story before I even had the chance to react. And people believed it. The comments were filled with hate, strangers calling me a monster, family members turning against me, and then, another notification popped up. I froze. A lawsuit. Patricia was suing me for the house, for her rightful inheritance, for everything. She was coming for it all, and I wasn't going to let her win. I sat there, gripping my phone, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just about revenge for her. This was about ruining me. She wanted to destroy me completely. She wanted to drag my name through the mud, take my father's home and make me look like the villain. But she underestimated me. Patricia was manipulative, cunning, a master at playing the victim. But she wasn't smart, not in the way that mattered, and she had just made a mistake. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think clearly. The lawsuit was a joke. The house was in a trust under my name. She had no legal claim to it. But Patricia didn't care about facts. She cared about winning the narrative. And the public was eating it up. I needed proof, real proof. And then, I remembered something. The secret my father never told her. I grabbed my keys and drove straight to my father's lawyer, Mr. Reynolds. When I stormed into his office, he was already on the phone, probably dealing with the media circus Patricia had unleashed. He hung up when he saw me and let out a sigh. I assume you've seen the news, he said dryly. "Oh, I've seen it," I muttered. "And I'm not going to let her get away with this." Reynolds leaned back in his chair. "She's banking on public sympathy," he said. "She knows she can't win in court, but she can make your life miserable in the process." I clenched my jaw. "Is there anything we can use to shut this down?" "I need something that proves what she really is." Reynolds gave me a long look. Then, slowly, he opened a drawer and pulled out a thick envelope. "This," he said, sliding it across the desk, "is something your father never told her about." I frowned, opening the envelope. Inside were legal documents, bank statements, transaction records, and something that made my stomach drop, a private investigator's report. "What is this?" I asked, flipping through the pages. Reynolds sighed. "Your father was a smart man, Daniel. And towards the end, he started to suspect Patricia was up to something. So he hired someone to look into her." I felt a chill run down my spine. I scanned the report, my hands shaking as I read through the findings. Patricia had been cheating on my father for years. Not just with one man, but several. Some of them were even using my father's money. She had been funneling funds into secret accounts, draining my father dry while pretending to be the devoted wife. But that wasn't the worst part. One document stood out, a signed contract. It was a prenup. A prenup she didn't know existed. My father had set it up before marrying her, making sure that if she ever betrayed him, if she cheated, stole from him, or did anything shady, she would walk away with nothing. I stared at the paper, my heart racing. "She has no idea about this, does she?" I asked. Reynolds smirked. "Not a clue." I exhaled sharply. This was it. This was the endgame. Patricia had spent years thinking she had played the perfect con, that she had manipulated my father into giving her everything. But the entire time, she had been walking straight into a trap. The takedown. I left Reynolds' office with the documents in hand, my mind spinning with possibilities. Patricia had gone to the media first. That was her mistake. She had thrown herself into the spotlight thinking it would protect her. But now I had the power to destroy her. I made a few calls. First, to a well-known journalist who actually cared about facts. Then to my father's closest friends, people who had really known him, people the media would listen to. Then I went home and waited. It didn't take long. The next morning, a new article dropped. One with a very different headline: "Grieving Widow or Heartless Scammer? The Truth About Patricia's Secret Affairs and Stolen Fortune." It went viral within hours. Screenshots from the prenup, bank records showing how she funneled my father's money into secret accounts, photos of her with other men while my father was dying in a hospital bed. The public turned on her instantly. The same people who had called me a monster yesterday were now ripping her apart. The comments were brutal. The media that had once painted her as a saint were now tearing her to shreds. Then, another bomb dropped. A fraud investigation. Turns out some of the money she had stolen from my father had been used in ways that were less than legal. And now, the IRS wanted a word with her. The final blow: the day after the article went live, Patricia showed up at my doorstep. Not the confident, smug woman I had known. She looked wrecked. Her hair was a mess. Her designer clothes were wrinkled. Her face was pale. She even went on a second media tour, sobbing about how I had set her up and stolen her rightful inheritance. It didn't work. Nobody believed her anymore. The final blow came when the fraud investigation turned up even more dirt. Turns out Patricia had been involved in a fake charity scheme. She had set up a bogus nonprofit in my father's name, while he was still alive, and funneled thousands of dollars into her personal accounts. And now, the feds were involved. One morning, I got a call from Reynolds. "You'll want to turn on the news," he said, barely containing his amusement. I grabbed the remote and flipped to the first news channel I could find. And there she was. Patricia being dragged out of her rented apartment in handcuffs. Her hair was a mess, her designer robe slipping off her shoulder as she screamed at the officers. "This is a mistake. I'm innocent. This is a witch hunt. My husband was a wealthy man. I was entitled to that money." The officers didn't care. They shoved her into the back of a squad car as cameras flashed around her. I sat back on the couch, letting out a slow breath. It was over. For real this time. Patricia's fate at trial was short. The evidence was stacked against her. Bank records, forged documents, and even recorded phone calls where she talked about bleeding the old man dry. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison for fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. She had no money left, no house, and no one to bail her out. And the best part? The little money she did have was seized by the government to pay off her debts. She walked into prison with nothing. My revenge? A quiet life after the dust settled. I took my time reclaiming the house. I had it deep cleaned, scrubbing away every trace of her presence. I renovated my father's office, turning it into a space where I could finally breathe again. And as for the money she stole, I made sure it went somewhere she would hate. I donated every recovered dollar in my father's name to cancer research, to shelters, to causes that actually help people. The final insult? The news got out about where the money went. So even after prison, Patricia would never escape my father's shadow. His name would be remembered for generosity, while hers would forever be tied to fraud and greed. The last time I saw her years later, I was walking through a grocery store when I saw her, Patricia. She was older now, her once flawless face lined with stress. She wore cheap clothes, her hair was dull, and the smug confidence that had once defined her was gone. She saw me too. For a second she froze. Then without a word she turned and rushed out of the store like a coward. I smiled to myself. I didn't need to say anything. She had lost, and she knew it.